Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I am here to thankfully and finally be able to give you my definitive review of the Canon RF 100-500mm F4.5-7.1L USM lens. This is basically a replacement for the excellent 100-400L Mark II for the EF mount, and it is a lens that I gave a very glowing review to back in the day, and I purchased one shortly thereafter and have never regretted owning the lens to this point. I've been really wanting to get a look at the RF 100-500 because obviously there are some interesting improvements there, most notably the addition of 100 millimeters of extra zoom range, which is unique in a lens like this and unique in a lens that has a footprint as small as this one does. The unfortunate, also complication that comes with moving to, it seems like any RF lens, is that the price has dramatically increased, and so right now retail is $2,300 on this lens. This lens is more like $2,900 US dollars, and so more on that in our wrap up and why even that is maybe a little bit deceptive. But today we're going to dive in and break down in depth the details of performance, autofocus, image quality, build and features, all of those things, and so you can really get a definitive understanding of whether or not this lens is worthy of your hard-earned dollars. But first, a word today from the sponsor of this video, which is NordVPN.
Today's episode is sponsored by NordVPN, the VPN recommended by top technology experts. Due to the pandemic, we are all online more than ever, and that means our precious data is even more at risk. NordVPN anonymizes your browsing data, protects your personal information, and even enables you to access content blocked in certain regions. Using NordVPN is incredibly simple, with apps for all your devices that allow you to get protected with literally just the click of a button. And with over 5,000 servers in 60 countries worldwide, it is easy to get protection without compromising speed. Visit nordvpn.com/Dustin or use coupon code Dustin to get a special discount on the VPN I've been personally using for years.
So here we have the new RF lens next to the lens that it's essentially replacing, and that's the EF 100-400L Mark II. And so as you can see from the kind of general impressions, the lenses are very similar, though you can tell that the new RF lens is a modern update. The EF lens looks a little bit dated by comparison, so we've got just a slight update in terms of the textures and the color here, and even the finish on the rings that just feels a little bit more modern by comparison. There are a lot of similarities here, but of course there are some differences as well. Both lenses are essentially identical in diameter at roughly 94 millimeters. Both of them have a 77 millimeter front filter thread. The RF lens, of course, has an extra 100 millimeters of focal length, and as a byproduct of that, it is a little bit longer. And as you can see here, I'll pop the cap off. You can see that the new RF lens is a little bit longer at 208 millimeters versus 192 millimeters. But surprisingly, the new RF lens is the lighter. The older lens is 1,640 grams, while the new lens is 1,365 grams. And so Canon has done a good job of shaving off a little bit of weight. The difference in the length is made up a bit by when you mount the lens hoods in place on both lenses. The lens hood on the EF lens is a little bit deeper, and so as you can see, it almost ends up in the same end result. I also will say that I really prefer the color matching lens hood as opposed to the older lens that feels like it's a lens hood that's borrowed from another lens, as the black finish doesn't really match the lens itself. So I think that this is a positive change for Canon, and also, welcome is the lens hood design that does have a little bit of an understanding that this is a lens that's often going to be placed like this, and it's not a full rubberized transition there, but there is some reinforcement that lets you know that they know that it's going to be used in that fashion. Canon has persisted in the design of having a actual window here on the lens hood. Unfortunately, my experience is that this isn't as useful as what I thought it would be. It's still not necessarily all that easy to get at a actual filter in many situations, and this window ends up being open more often than it's closed, which means that a lot of times you'll have stray light coming in that you don't necessarily want there. So the lenses have a similar amount of rings here and basic ring placement, though there is an additional ring that is on the new RF lens, which is the standard control ring that can be used in a variety of functions, and you can program that from within the camera. It is clicked, and so if you want it declicked, that is a separate service from Canon. Beyond that, the rings are in similar position in that we've got a manual focus ring, which as you can see is narrower than the one that is on the EF version. This, of course, on the RF is focused by wire, so it's focus emulation, and it does a pretty good job. And of course, you will have in manual focus the various focus aids that are within the camera body. One area that is similar but different in behavior is we have the smooth and tight tension ring here that is designed to prevent lens creep. And so in the smooth position, you can see that the lens will creep down. However, if you put that into the tight position, which I'll lock it down here, you can see that it helps to prevent zoom creep. A difference here, however, is that you can still actually, even in the tightest position, you can still move the actual ring, and with, you know, there's not a huge amount of variability there. There is more tension on the tight setting, but it doesn't lock altogether. Whereas on the EF lens, if you actually put it into the tight position, which I will do here, in the tight position, it is much more resistant to movement, and in the smooth position, there is definitely a lot of difference there's just, I think, more variability in the design, at least in the copies that I am testing here. The the zoom ring here is nice and wide, and particularly if you're in the smooth position, the zoom action is nice and smooth. There is a little bit less of a pump feel as compared to the EF lens. The EF lens, let me loosen that up again. The EF lens just has more of a feeling of a pump, and it gets looser. There's just, again, more variability in that behavior there. Now, a difference in the design comes in the design of the tripod collar. The tripod collar on the EF version was unique in that the tripod collar itself is not removable. Instead, the foot is removable via this knob here. You have a more traditional tripod collar that is fully removable here, and so you can actually loosen it up at this point, and you can remove the tripod collar itself. Now, I like having a fully removable tripod collar. It does just allow you, this lens is light enough that you can use it without if you so desire, and it's an easy system for either removing or adding it back on. And so a nice design there. My only criticism of the tripod collar is that there is no detents at the cardinal positions, and so you just have to, instead, you have to just kind of line them up. There is a mark that is very faint and not easy to see on the lens barrel that can align that in the standard position, but outside of that, you're just kind of having to do it by feel and line that up there. And so I do wish that there was some detents in that. My other criticism is a long-standing Canon criticism, and that is that these tripod feet, as you can see, it's a little bit more robust, but what it isn't is ARCA compatible, which means you're gonna have to use a quick release plate to use on that if you so desire. There is a bank of switches here, and that includes a focus limiter that is full, and then 3 meters to infinity, so you can eliminate the close focus abilities. There's an AF/MF switch. There is an on and off for the stabilizer, and then 3 modes for the stabilizer, including the 1, which is the standard, 2, which is for panning, and so it only it will not stabilize on one axis, and then in 3, which is a dynamic mode, and that will give you less stability in the viewfinder, and it focuses on stabilizing the image at capture. Now, both of these are variable aperture zooms, and so obviously the older lens is f4.5 to f5.6, so a much smaller aperture variability. In this case, on the new lens, it's f4.5 to f7.1. And I will have to say, it is really weird to say f7.1L. That doesn't sound like an L designation at all. Unfortunately, the new lens doesn't hold on to the wider maximum apertures quite as long. The only difference or variability in that is that it does hold f4.5 just a little bit longer, up to 151 millimeters versus 135 millimeters on the EF lens. But the EF lens holds f5 for a long time, from 135 to 312 millimeters, whereas the new lens only holds it to 254 millimeters, and then it switches to f5.6. By 363 millimeters, it's at f6.3. So obviously at 400 millimeters, there's a bit of an advantage for this in light gathering. And it does hold f6.3 all the way to 472 millimeters. And it's only at that last bit, that last 28 millimeters, where we go to f7.1. The other alternate way to look at that is that this does natively reach all the way to 500 millimeters, whereas on the other lens, with the 1.4 times extender, you can get to 560 millimeters, but at a maximum aperture of f8. And so you do have a little bit of light gathering advantage. And I will also note that if you're talking about weight savings, by the time if you're wanting to use this on RF and you throw on the adapter, then you throw on top of that the extender if you want to reach as far, you're obviously ending up with a lens that is both larger and heavier. So there is a net advantage for the new lens when it comes to that. Both lenses have 9 rounded aperture blades inside, and as far as the handling in the field, I will note that the new lens does feel just a little bit better to me. It feels just a little bit more modern, a little bit tighter in performance. Now obviously that is an older lens versus one that has had maybe less use, but the old lens has held up really, really well. But I will say that the new lens feels just a little bit better in terms of operation in the field. For the most part, I was really happy with the handling of it. And of course, this is a very portable lens for a lens that reaches all the way to 500 millimeters.
So obviously there are a lot of pros in the build and the design here, and a few negatives. A few other things that I do want to just highlight and talk about is, number one, the weather sealing. As an L series telephoto zoom, Canon always gives these a really great build quality, which I believe is true here. In this case, we've got 15 different seal points, at least 15 that I can count from this diagram. And so it is well sealed all throughout, has fluorine coatings on both the front and the rear element. Those help with oil and fingerprints, just, furthering the build quality here. And, if it's anything like this lens, I've been using this lens for at least 5 years, 6 years at this point, and essentially it still looks like new. It is held up really, really well. Not everyday use. I don't always reach for a lens like this, but certainly has been a very durable lens. There is another aspect, however, that is, in my mind, a little bit negative in terms of the new design, and unfortunately somewhat of a trend, similar to what we've seen with the 70 to 200 lenses, and that this lens is not really fully compatible with the 1.4 times or 2 times extenders or teleconverters that come from Canon. And what I mean by that is that at the fully retracted position at 100 millimeters, as you can see, the rear element, there is glass that comes all the way to the rear of the lens. So when you're attaching an extender, and I'm using the EF version here for illustration, there is a portion of the extender that actually needs to extend into the rear barrel. And so on a lens like the EF 100-400L Mark II, that's no problem. I can do that in the fully retracted position because the lens is designed with room for that to fit in. That's not the case with the RF lens, and part of the design and making it as compact as what it was is that you have to be zoomed out basically to 300 millimeters before there is sufficient room created to attach an extender. So technically it is compatible with Canon's RF mount extenders, but only from 300 to 500 millimeters, and that's the only place that they'll actually physically fit. And so the downside of that is obviously if you attach the extender, you lose the ability to go any wider. Even with the 1.4 extender, you can't go any wider than 420 millimeters. Well, that's somewhat limiting. So you get a 420 to 700 millimeter equivalent focal length with the 1.4 extender attached. That becomes even more extreme with the 2 times extender attached, and that your widest you can go is 600 millimeters, and you can go all the way up to 1,000 millimeters, which of course is a tempting proposition. But what it does mean is that you also can't fully retract the lens for storage, and so that means you're going to have to dismount in the field, and you're, unless you have some kind of storage solution that's going to allow you to have, the kind of length that we're looking at here. The other downside is we have such a small maximum aperture on the telephoto end of this lens. It means you're going to get some really slow maximum apertures. And so the fastest you get with the 1.4 times is f8, but by the end of it, you're at f10. If you put the 2 times extender on there, you're starting at f11 and going as small as f4. f14. And so obviously that is severely limiting the amount of light that's reaching the sensor. So you're going to have to really use the lens in optimal lighting conditions if you're going to get the best performance out of it. Fortunately, these RF bodies do have great sensitivity, and so it does help in that aspect. One other thing that I do want to discuss before we begin to talk about autofocus is the image stabilization that is a part of the lens. It is rated at 5 stops, and if you're using it on a camera with in-body image stabilization, like my R5, the R6, the R3, you're going to get a rating up to 6 stops. Of course, it's impossible to parse out what is body stabilization, what's lens stabilization, because you can't turn them on or off independently. But what I did find is that I felt like the stabilization was good. I don't know if it was noticeably better than what I saw with the older EF lens, but certainly it was a good performance. I did find for video here, obviously, there is a huge difference between trying to handhold 500 millimeters and then when the IS clicks on, that you can still see some rise and fall from my breathing. The long telephoto length exaggerates any kind of movement like that, and so it's very obvious when there is any kind of movement. But if you're being careful, you can handhold video shots like these and get good results. And in certain situations, you can shoot at low shutter speeds and for stills and still get decently still results. So just remember there are practical limits to that, and if you're shooting action, you need to keep that shutter speed up. So let's talk about autofocus and how the lens performs in that metric.
The RF 100-500L is equipped with dual nano USM focus motors here. And so this is the second application we've seen of, at least I've seen of this, the other being the 70-200 F2.8L. And obviously I'm a fan of Canon's nano USM. I think it's really the best equivalent of some of the better like linear type motors that I see from some other manufacturers. And in this case, having the dual motor really allows it to have the sufficient torque and speed that it needs for high demanding applications. This obviously is a lens that's going to be used by those that shoot bird in flight or shoot action, maybe even sports, as long as it's reasonably well lit. And so we need to have the kind of focus speed that's going to enable the lens to keep up. And I would say that Canon has succeeded in doing that. There's not a radical difference here between what I see with the 100-400L Mark II, even adapted, but what I do see is maybe just a little bit faster speed, and definitely it's a little bit quieter in operation. And so the advantage of having a system that is designed for mirrorless means that you're getting just a little bit smoother and quieter operation, and that's really going to pay dividends, obviously, when it comes to video work as well. Now, when it comes to tracking action, I had an opportunity. I visited Myrtle Beach over our March break, and so I had an opportunity to just to do a lot of shooting of things like seabirds. And so whether they were birds in flight, as you can see here, or the sandpipers that move very on their feet but move very fast and erratically, I found that as far as focus had no problem keeping up. And with the more erratic type birds, it was really the greater challenge was more just kind of keeping it in the frame properly. But as far as focus accuracy, I had really good results on an EOS R5 body, and byproduct of that is that I got a lot of really great looking action shots, bird and flight shots that are really crisply focused, but also managed to track the action throughout the frame. And I was even able to get good focus results when I was tracking a gull, and it just the pattern it was going. So I was doing a panning type tracking, and so it flew right to where I was going, right through the glare of the sun. And so even though that there was some variability, huge variability in the lighting throughout the sequence, the tracking held on really, really well. And so very positive end results on that. As far as focus speed, the only time I really saw any kind of focus delay or slowdown at all was if I was going from close to minimum focus to infinity, and there would be that split-second pause, before momentum gathered and it made the then quick focus change. And so there is a focus limiter, and I would say that if you don't need close focus capabilities, if you switch that on, it's going to eliminate that as a possibility. Overall, however, though, I was really happy with my focus results. I was also happy, though it's not, I don't think, the primary purpose of this lens, certainly a secondary or tertiary application of the lens could be for doing portrait work. And IAF worked just fine. Obviously, IAF is going to work best
when you're tighter in on the subject and, you know, the eye occupies a larger portion of the frame and it tracks it more, you know, reasonably then. But, you know, whether or not I had actual lock on the eye or more just on the body or the face, depending on the focus distance, I ended up getting really good focus in results. And in fact, the only time that I saw maybe negative focus results was I was stopped down a little bit further and shooting in a backlit situation, and I got a couple of shots that were not accurately focused. But you know, out of dozens of portrait shots, almost all of them were really well focused. And so I have no real complaints about focus here. It seems to do the job. It's quick, it's quiet, it's efficient.
So good findings when it comes to autofocus, and I found the lens to be pretty much a delight using it in the field and tracking action. Modern mirrorless cameras and good lenses make tracking action really a pretty painless process these days, and that's obviously one of the huge advantages of some of these modern cameras and lenses and their design. But let's talk about image quality. Obviously there's a big price premium over a lens that was already excellent optically, so is this new lens improved optically relative to the benchmark of the 100-400L Mark II? Well, let's dive in, let's take a look.
So we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. So I did want to show you this before I show anything that's corrected, just to make, again, a general observation that for whatever reason, with charts like this, the auto white balance does a really terrible job on the Canon R5. And so this is really a more accurate white balance. And so I have to do a manual correction every time. And so you can see that there is some, you know, again, very negligible, almost no distortion. And there is some moderate vignette there that clears up as I, you know, with the profile without any kind of problem. So here's my manual correction, and to show you how I got there, I added a +1, so there is the tiniest amount of barrel distortion that is there. And then, again, moderate amount of vignette. For a Canon RF lens, this is a pretty strong performance. I only needed a +50, so not quite 2 stops to correct for it, and the midpoint slid all the way over, and that allows for a nicely corrected result. Now at 500 millimeters, you can see that there's an inversion to a mild amount of pincushion distortion. And again, the vignette is nicely linear. It's not really concentrated in the corner, and we can see that in the correction. So here's my manual correction, and there's a -3 dialed in on the distortion, and then a +33. So just around a stop. And again, it's very linear, and it moves towards the center a lot. So moving that midpoint all the way over will allow for a cleaner end result. So let's take a look at our chart test for resolution and contrast. So first of all, I have got on the left side, always in comparisons, will be the RF lens. I've been doing this using the EOS R5, which is a 45 megapixel sensor, currently the highest resolution R body available. And in this case, as always, using a heavy duty tripod, using a 2-second delay to eliminate vibration. And when I've done comparison to the EF lens on the left or on the right side, I'll make mention of that, and so you know what we're looking at. We're going to be looking at these results at 200% magnification, as I think that really helps to illustrate the point here. So first of all, in the center of the frame, we have got a very, very sharp result at 100 millimeters, and you can see that there's a little bit of a difference in metering. I slightly prefer the EF's metering here, a little bit brighter and I think a little bit more accurate, but you can see that both of them are very, very good in the center of the frame. If we move off center a bit, we see that again there's a little bit of a difference in terms of the exposure. I do think that there's a little bit more contrast that is there for the RF lens moving down into the corner, and so we'll start over here. You can see just a little bit more contrast for the RF lens looking at this insignia here. I think that there's a little bit more resolution and contrast, and then off towards the edge, just a mild advantage for the RF lens. So if we compare f4.5 to f5.6, first of all, we see in the center of the frame that there is a mildly stronger amount of contrast. You can see a bit in the kind of the bonnet or head covering there. And moving over here to the side, I mean, that's fantastic looking. I mean, it's resolving extremely highly. And I don't see a huge uptick in resolution there, nor do I really see a big one here. It's very good wide open with only a very moderate increase when you stop it down. Likewise, moving on to f8, I really don't see much of an advantage. I don't think that diffraction is really causing any kind of issues yet here, but wherever I look, there's at best just a little bit of a boost in contrast, no real advantage in terms of resolution with stopping the lens down. Now this lens has a fairly extreme minimum aperture, and so even here on the wide end it's f32, but as per usual, it's to be avoided basically at all cost. You can see that diffraction, particularly on a high resolution body, just kills image quality, particularly when it comes to contrast and the ability to resolve those fine details. Just avoid it. Now at 200 millimeters, we can see, again, comparing with the EF lens there on the right, but we can see that the two lenses deliver, once again, a fairly similar performance. In this case, we've got equal shutter speed and exposure, but we've got a little bit more brightness for the EF lens. And it is, I believe, ever so slightly here. It is the brighter of the two lenses, and so you can see that there. Pretty much similar result in the center of the frame. Here at the mid frame, I do think that the contrast favors the RF lens just a little bit more. Even in this texture here, you can see that it's just a little bit better on the RF lens. And if we move down into this corner here, that looks fairly similar, but again, just a little bit more contrast on the RF lens. Likewise over here. If we take a look up in the other corner, we see a nicely balanced performance with both lenses working about equally. Now, of course, it's just a mild stop down to the next full stop, which is f5.6. And at least in the center of the frame, that's not enough to really make any kind of difference. In the mid frame here, maybe a little bit brighter looking image, so a little bit of improvement in contrast. But for the most part, we've got a pretty similar looking image. Stopping on down to f8, once again, doesn't really produce any kind of true improvement here. You're getting very close to maximum performance wide open. Now at 200 millimeters, our minimum aperture is f36. And again, as you can see, I'm not going to continue to show you these. Just note that we get to really crazy extremes on the telephoto end. You should just avoid them. So moving on to 300 millimeters, you can see that there is an aperture advantage for the older EF lens. It's still holding f5 here compared to f5.6. Now they metered the same way, but the image on the right from the EF version is definitely the brighter of the two. So in the center of the frame, both lenses looking excellent as per usual. I would say that that extra bit of brightness gives a little extra pop to the EF lens in terms of the contrast and just the general brightness, but the two images, as you can see, are very, very close in performance. Everywhere that I look, this is, I would say, the area where the EF lens has compared maybe the most favorably in the corner, where it looks very similar in terms of sharpness and contrast, and that slightly brighter performance gives it a little extra edge. So in this case, we'll go the full stop up to f8, and you can see there is a little bit of improvement, I think, in terms of the brightness of the image, so a little bit better contrast. And looking here in the mid frame, once again, I don't know that there is anything really significantly different between the two. The good news is you're getting pretty close to maximum performance wide open across this particular lens, and we'll pop up into the other corner where you see a very even performance, nicely centered copy. Now 400 millimeters is where the EF lens ends in terms of its focal range. Obviously we have another 100 millimeters to go on the RF lens, and it's here where I saw the chief advantage for the RF lens. You can tell it's not at its limit in terms of focal length because it's still performing at the same high level, whereas there is a mild drop off for the EF lens to where it loses the contrast battle here. Even though it has a slight aperture advantage, a 1/3 stop aperture advantage, it's just not quite as strong in terms of contrast, though as we move off towards the edge, the advantage is not as pronounced, though you can definitely see here that it's just not quite as good as what the RF lens is there in the corner. Now, if we stopped at the RF lens down to f8, we really see that the results look more similar than different. I don't see any kind of big breakthrough. You've already got great performance wide open, and so stopping down really is going to be more about depth of field than it is some kind of optical improvement there from what I can tell. So at the end of the range, we have a maximum aperture of only f7.1, but again, to be fair, with the EF lens, you have to put the 1.4 times extender on there to get to, and that gives you a maximum aperture of f8. So you actually have a little bit of an aperture advantage there. As, of course, you will also have some size advantage without having to use an adapter and to use the teleconverter there. And so as far as the performance, really the EF lens does quite well with the extender attached. And so there is, I think, a little bit more contrast to be seen on the RF lens, but it's not significant. And we can see here that, again, the performance is very, very similar, only a mild difference off into the corner. They look very, very similar. Maybe a slight advantage for the RF lens, but really not a whole lot. We've got pretty much the same performance here across. In this case, we got a little bit more centered look up in this corner from the RF lens. But overall, there's maybe a very mild advantage for the RF lens, but it's not significant. I will make one final observation on this. Even though I show 504 millimeters on this combination, I actually had to be a little bit closer to frame this properly compared to the RF lens. And so I don't think the RF lens suffers from focus breathing to the same degree that the 100-400L does, which in some situations is obviously going to give you an advantage, and you get a little bit more of that maximum focal length. In fact, I would go so far as to say that I was further away at 500 millimeters with the RF lens than what I was at 560 millimeters framing my test chart. And so I was several feet further away with the RF lens to get similar framing to 560 millimeters on the EF lens. Now, that wouldn't be true at infinity, but up at, closer. And so in this case, about 10 meters away, somewhere close to 30 feet, there's definitely a difference in the framing due to that focus breathing. So as before, you're getting pretty much maximum performance wide open. We can see that stopping down to f8 really has not made any kind of noticeable improvement in the center of the frame. A little bit brighter in image, and I think that contrast, you maybe pick up a little bit of contrast when you stop down. But outside of that, the lens all throughout the range is very consistently giving you close to its maximum performance from wide open, which is obviously very useful in a lens that has a smaller maximum aperture on the telephoto end. We'll take a quick look at some real-world images. So first of all, as you can see, this is a great lens even for doing landscape type work because it just resolves lots and lots of detail, as you can see. Now, the further that you look out, the more that you're going to see the shimmer from heat waves. It is going to rob resolution. So if you were focused over here, you might have be tempted to say, well, the lens isn't really all that sharp. No, that's just the reality of shooting over the thermal pockets with a telephoto lens. It does impact image quality, but if we look, where that's less of a factor, you're going to see a very high resolving of details. And obviously up close, we're going to get really nice results here. And so again, this is 45 megapixel, but you can see just how finely rendered all of the details are, and the feathers here looks very, very crisp, great looking image. This little sandpiper here, you can see it's resolved very nice. Colors look good. The bokeh quality looks fairly good. I'm not yet convinced that it is as nice as what the EF lens was. I've always been really pleasantly surprised by the EF lens, but the RF lens is very, very good as well. Once again, even, bird in flight, but you can see that autofocus has nailed where it should. This is one of a series of images, and you can just see that it's resolved very, very nicely in this image. Again, a very dynamic, high action image here, but you can see that, on the area of focus, on this gull here, that everything is really nice and crisp. And again, the bokeh quality looks pretty good here. It's not as creamy as some lenses might be, but a very nice performance. A similar type image here. You can just see that the lens does a great job of capturing colors and light, and it's a professional grade lens, and it shows it. Now, one area where the EF lens was really strong is in its maximum magnification at 400 millimeters, and so it allowed for a 0.31 times magnification. Very impressive. But the RF lens does it one better, and at 500 millimeters, you are getting a 0.33 times magnification, or basically a 1:3 magnification ratio, which is obviously fantastic. So that means you're able to take small objects and magnify them very nicely. And so in this flower, for example, you can see that the stamen here I'm able to get in really, really close, not quite to a macro level, obviously, and I don't think with a macro kind of resolution, but a pretty nice side benefit of the lens. Now, flare resistance isn't always a forte for telephoto lenses. I do think that this RF lens does a pretty good job. This was maybe my worst example, but I do want to give the caveat that it was in the middle of I was tracking action in a long sequence, and so the exposure value changed radically as we passed across the very bright morning sun. And so, in other cases where the lens was exposing, more for a single shot scene, obviously you don't have nearly as much flare artifacts. And really this was about as much as I saw, just a little bit of a ghosting artifact there. Overall, however, I think that the images held up quite well. Likewise here, as we transition into our final series looking at this lens for shooting portraits, not its first purpose, but certainly a nice secondary or tertiary application for it. Again, shooting right into the sun here, I was using obviously some flash from the front to help to balance exposure and a little extra tweaking in post, but as you can see, it handled the very bright scene with aplomb, no real ghosting artifacts showing up anywhere else. And here was more of a casual portrait type thing, just available light. And you can see that the lens has done a great job with the detail and the contrast on the subjects. And as we look towards the out of focus background, I was also shooting in this setting with an 85mm f1.4. I definitely prefer the 85mm f1.4, but you can see that it does a fairly good job, just a little bit more outlining in some of this area than what I would necessarily like. Now, if you're shooting a little bit tighter and the background is further out, obviously you can really compress scenes, and the detail here is lovely. This is just the available sun on my daughter's face very early in the morning along the beach there, and so you can see a beautiful result and a very nicely blurred out background. Here, a little bit of a wider shot. And of course, the advantage of a zoom lens is you have a lot of options for how you're going to frame a portrait scene. And so here we can see the radically different kind of framing, but another beautiful end result that comes out of that. And one final portrait shot at more of a medium distance and medium in the range. You can see beautiful detail. And again, the background looks nice. It's not like a portrait lens nice, but overall, I think that it looks quite good, and obviously the total image looks really fantastic.
And so, image quality, I wouldn't say is radically improved. It is marginally improved in a couple of areas, but if you're looking at this as being a major upgrade, if you already own this lens, and you think you're going to go into a new category optically, I don't think that is really the case. But the big advantage you are getting is the fact that you get that extra 100 millimeters of reach. 500 millimeters is a significant amount of reach, and I did notice, as I comment as a part of that this lens does tend to focus breathe less, and so it also means you're going to be able to take advantage of the longer focal lengths at closer distances, and that certainly is an advantage. At the end of the day, whether or not this is the lens for you is going to have to do a lot with the psychology of the price. Although there are plenty of people that aren't thrilled by that minimum aperture of f7.1, I don't think that's necessarily a deal breaker for a lot of people. But when you combine that with a price tag of $2,900 US and likely higher for many of you in your various markets around the world, it does become a significant psychological barrier. As I noted at the beginning, this lens, the EF lens, is currently priced at $2,300, but that's only because they've raised the price a couple of $100 in the last couple of years. Prior to that, the lens retailed for a price tag of more like, around $2,100 and or $2,200, and so the price difference between the two is more like $700. A lens that's around $2,200, you're thinking $2,000 range. A lens that's $2,900, you're thinking $3,000 range. Well, that's a significant difference in terms of how you evaluate. But I will point out a couple of reasons to maybe consider that. If you routinely would like more than 400 millimeters of reach, remember when it comes to the pricing that to get above 500 millimeters, you can get up to 560 with the 1.4 times attach. But that Canon extender is going to run you, roughly $500. So by the time you have the extender, you have the bare lens and an adapter, if you happen to want to use it on a mirrorless body, well, you are all the way up to that price point. And obviously with some extra inconvenience when it comes to these extra layers that you're having to use. This lens is a native mount, and it reaches all the way to 500 millimeters which for many people is going to be enough reach. And of course, if you're using it on a higher resolution body like this, you have the ability for some deep cropping as well, which means that very likely you're going to get as much reach as you need natively out of the lens. And that is probably the greatest advantage / convenience of the lens, biggest reason to upgrade. If you're just buying the lens fresh, I don't necessarily recommend going back to the EF mount because you're going to have to use the adapter, and it's just kind of a weird upgrade path, I would say. Now, the only reason I would say to consider that is if you find, for example, a really great deal on the EF lens, maybe a used copy, and so there is a huge price difference between the two, then it might be worth doing, because this lens continues to operate really quite well when adapted to the newer RF bodies. So at the end of the day, this is a somewhat complicated conclusion in that the lens itself is excellent. It performs at a very high level, has very good image quality, great autofocus performance, and it is a very attractive package in how compact it is for a lens that reaches from as wide as 100 millimeters and as far as 500 millimeters. But it is very expensive, and you're going to have to take that into consideration as to whether your budget and your inclination extends that far. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, you can find linkage to my full text review. You can also find linkage to an image gallery and check out some beautiful photos I was able to get with the lens. Beyond that, there are buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself, and linkage to follow myself or Craig on social media or check out our new channel, Letthelightin TV. There is also linkage there to become a patron, to purchase channel merchandise, and of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Ring that bell so you get notified when new content drops. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.